A woman named Nada Kavgic was working in Hotel St. Jörgen in Swedish city Malmö. It was a cold January day in 1972. She and few of her colleagues were about to travel to Zagreb in the next few days. They were often traveling these routes because they were from Yugoslavia, but they were working in Malmö, so from time to time they went home to visit their families. Nada and her colleagues had bought plane tickets from Yat Airlines, largest Yugoslavian airline. They were always looking forward to traveling with Yat because the food aboard was very good. On the day they were supposed to travel, hotel manager approached Nada and one other colleague, Ljubica, and told them that they have received a last-minute reservation for the hotel, 3 buses of Russian guests which were arriving as they spoke. Obviously, Nada and Ljubica were very dissatisfied and even angry, because it was a last-minute notice which would completely change their plans. They argued with the manager and Nada even called him a monkey. However, the manager promised them a few extra vacation days, so they finally accepted to miss the flight and stay working in the hotel. 3 of their colleagues boarded a plane. One of them was a father who went to pick up his daughter staying at her grandma's. Little did Nada and Ljubica know that this decision from their manager, which they protested and were so angry about, has saved their lives. Literally. Several days later, on another cold day in February in 1972, in Czechoslovakia, a young 22-year-old woman opened her eyes and was left confused. She was lying in a bed in a hospital room. She wanted to get up and exit the room to see where she was and why, but intense pain stopped her and she didn't have the strength to get out of the bed. She was even more confused now. It was obvious that she was badly hurt, but she didn't remember what happened and why she was in the hospital. The last thing she could remember was greeting the passengers who boarded a plane in Copenhagen. If we go back to a few days earlier and to Nada and Ljubica working in a hotel in Malmö, after their discussion with the manager about staying, that afternoon one of their colleagues in the hotel came running and screaming to Nada and Ljubica, who were setting tables at a hotel restaurant. It was hard to understand what he was yelling, and he was in complete shock. The words started to get clearer. They died! They died! He was referring to 3 of their colleagues who boarded a plane that day. He said to Nada and Ljubica that their plane crashed. In Czechoslovakia, Vesna was lying in a hospital bed and found out that she was in a coma for a few days. However, she did not receive a clear explanation to what happened to her, just that she was in an accident, which was already obvious to her as she was lying badly hurt and couldn't move much. Vesna's mother and father and her 18-year-old brother rushed from Yugoslavia, their home country, to little town České Kamenice, where Vesna was lying in the hospital. When Vesna's brother, Dragan, entered her room, he asked her, "Vesna, do you know who I am?" And she replied, "Yes, I know, and you are very impudent." "Why, sister?" he said. "Why am I impudent?" "Because you don't let me move my arms and wave with my hands," she replied. She recognized her mother and father as well. But why were they all scared and so careful with her? She would soon learn the truth about what happened to her. The truth which was hidden from her for about 2 weeks from her awakening, because the doctors thought the shock of finding out could negatively affect her already medically difficult and vulnerable state. The truth was that she was the only surviving soul from Yat Airlines Flight 367, which crashed above little Czechoslovakian town Srpska Kamenice, near border with East Germany, 46 minutes after departing from Copenhagen. The same flight Nada and Ljubica in Malmö were so angry to miss. To understand how unbelievable and miraculous is the story of Vesna, who even holds the Guinness record, we need to go back to the beginning. Vesna Vulovic was born on 3rd of January in 1950 in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was a country in Southeast and Central Europe which stopped existing at the end of 1980s and beginning of 1990s, when several smaller countries were formed on its territory. She grew up and finished primary and secondary school in the city of Belgrade. Her father was a businessman and her mother was a fitness trainer. Vesna was also into sports. She trained basketball, gymnastics, and then ballet. As she was very interested in foreign languages, she enrolled in Faculty of Philology and Cultural Studies. Driven by her love of the Beatles, after completing first year of university, she went to United Kingdom to perfect her English. She started to travel and liked that kind of lifestyle. On her way back to Belgrade, she met her friend, who was a flight attendant. That friend inspired her to turn that into her profession as well and started to work as a flight attendant. Soon after completing her training, she started to work for Yacht Airlines. On that fateful day, 26th of January 1972, 22-year-old Vesna was called to be a part of flight crew on Yacht Flight 367, which was flying from Copenhagen to Belgrade. The flight was actually from Stockholm to Belgrade, with stopovers at Copenhagen and Zagreb. In Copenhagen, there was a crew change and Vesna boarded the airplane as a part of the secondary crew. It departed from Copenhagen at 3:15 p.m. and never reached their second stopover in Zagreb. "46 minutes after departure, at 4:01 p.m., there was an explosion in the baggage compartment, which caused the aircraft to break apart over Czechoslovak village Srpska Kamenice, only minutes after crossing the border from East Germany to Czechoslovakia. The aircraft was flying with speed of approximately 870 kilometers at height of 33,000 feet. After the explosion, first it started to lose speed. Pilots were investing enormous efforts to keep the plane in the air. Pilot in command was Ludwig Ransdrich, an experienced pilot who was even an instructor for that type of aircraft, McDonnell Douglas DC-9. Unfortunately, the explosion damaged the plane too much, and it crashed, falling apart into 3 pieces. At the time of the crash, local villager and lumberjack Bruno Henke was chopping wood when he heard a bang from explosion. He ran to the clearing and literally saw people and various objects falling from the sky. The plane didn't fall vertically, but was flying somewhat like a butterfly while falling, and the metal parts scattered all over the place in an area of 15 kilometers. The mail and packages from the aircraft scattered in large radius of 30 kilometers. In that area, other citizens also heard the explosion and ran outside, distressed, yelling that the plane had crashed somewhere near. Srpska Kamenice was a village with only 250 inhabitants at that time. Suddenly, Bruno heard a woman's voice, shouting from the left side of the woods. He ran even faster towards the voice. It was a cold winter day. Sun was setting, snow on the ground, and the terrain was slippery. When he arrived to the place from which the woman was yelling, he couldn't believe his eyes. There was a pair of legs sticking out of plane wreckage. It was the tail of the plane, which landed about 500 meters from the closest houses. He leaned over to have a better look, and he saw a blonde female who was not only alive, but had enough strength to yell. Fortunately, Bruno Henke just so happened to be a former medic in the German army during the Second World War, and he was able to provide first aid in a proper manner. He struggled to move the heavy metal parts with minimally moving Vesna, because he knew that only one wrong move can worsen her injuries. He stayed with her until the ambulance came, and he handed over Vesna to the emergency medics. There was another woman in the tail of the plane next to Vesna, but unfortunately, she has already passed away. The ambulance transported Vesna to the hospital in nearby town Czechoslovakia Kamenice. Upon arrival to the hospital, she slipped into coma. Vesna's turquoise uniform was soaked in blood, and the doctors needed to cut her clothes. Her stiletto heels were torn off by the force during the fall. She received 2 liters of blood, and Dr. Randa, who was the first to treat her in the hospital, was trying to stabilize her pulse, which was the most important thing at that moment to save her life. After a few days, she regained consciousness. Dr. Randa didn't leave her side until she was transferred with her bed to Military Medical Academy in Prague a few days later. Vesna had a microphone over her bed so that the doctors and nurses could hear if she will say or need anything at any moment. At one point, in a frenzy, she started saying, "I can't help you. I can't." Probably she was unconsciously remembering the fall. Unconsciously because she had no memory whatsoever about what happened. At that point, she wasn't yet completely awakened and had no clue what was happening and where she was. The microphone also recorded the following words from her bed. "Please, give me my toothbrush. It is in my cosmetic bag. Oh, where is my cosmetic bag?" Not having any idea that her vanity case flew from the plane somewhere in the woods and the snow. After she stabilized enough, she was assessed to see what was the damage to her body and what was needed to done next to help her. She had fractured skull and suffered cerebral hemorrhage. She also had both legs broken and 3 broken vertebrae, one of which was crushed completely. Her pelvis was fractured and she had several ribs broken. Her injuries resulted in being temporarily paralyzed below the waist. As mentioned, Vesna had a complete amnesia regarding the fall, and the last moment she remembered was greeting the passengers in Copenhagen. This kind of amnesia is called partial retrograde amnesia, and people who have it can't recall memories that were formed recently before the event that caused the amnesia, but remember almost everything else. In Vesna's case, it was caused by brain trauma received in the crash. When the doctors decided it was safe for her condition to learn about what exactly happened to her, they showed her the newspapers, which were full of the news about a plane crash, as that was a global news and one of the most important ones in those days. Upon seeing what happened, Vesna fainted. When she was being transferred from hospital in Czechoslovakia Kamenice, the clinical center in Prague, with the military helicopter, she was offered a hypnotic injection due to her recent trauma caused by flying. However, Vesna declined the injection, explaining that she was not afraid of flying, as she didn't have any memory of what happened, so she didn't feel any negative emotions with regard to it. In hospital in Prague, Vesna was under various treatments and was hospitalized there until 12th of March. She had a surgical procedure done on her fractured vertebrae, which was more than successful due to the fact that, fortunately, spinal cord was intact. She also had some additional procedures to restore her movement. In the beginning, she was only able to move her left leg, but after a month she started to move right leg as well. On 12th of March, she was transported to hospital in her hometown Belgrade. She continued to recover there in the next 3 months and was discharged in June 1972. After that, she traveled to Montenegro to recuperate in a seaside resort, where she was still visited by her doctors every 2 or 3 days. Vesna's parents had to sell both of their cars to pay for the medical costs. In later interviews, Vesna said that she received compensation from Yat Airlines and social insurance. However, that was spent mostly on her medical bills and wasn't enough to cover all medical and life expenses. She regained the ability to walk after 10 months, and in total her recovery lasted 16 months. Miraculously, she recovered almost completely, but continued to walk with a limp for the rest of her life. Both of Vesna's parents died in the following years after the accident. Vesna believed that the stress and trauma from her crash in the end had taken their health and consequently their life. There were in total 28 passengers aboard of Flight 367, 6 crew members and 22 passengers. All of them, except Vesna, lost their lives in the crash. Some of them died from the initial blast. Some of them were sucked out of the plane to freezing temperatures when the cabin depressurized. And some probably died from the crash with the land. In the past, there were plane crashes where people survived, even falls from pretty high altitudes. There was a Soviet Air Force lieutenant, Ivan Chisov, who had fallen 22,000 feet to the snow from the aircraft and survived. There was also a Royal Air Force tail gunner, Nicholas Alcmeid, who survived falling from 18,000 feet during World War II. But until miraculous survival of Vesna Vulović, it was thought that it is completely impossible to survive a plane crash or any kind of fall from that altitude, 33,330 feet. In 1985, Vesna entered Guinness Book of World Records for surviving the highest fall without a parachute. She received a recognition at the London Gala ceremony, and the person who handed her the award was Paul McCartney. To this day, nobody broke this record, and Vesna still holds it. Medical and other experts were just baffled with her unbelievable survival. During her fall, Vesna actually survived several times. First, she could die due to the lack of oxygen at the height of 33,000 feet and freezing from the temperature, minus 50 degrees Celsius. Second time she could lose her life was from sudden decompression. Third time was from the fall from the high altitude, which usually causes the heart to burst. Fourth time could have been from the collision with the ground. Fifth time was when she was injured and stuck between metal wreckage. If the man who found her, Bruno Henke, wasn't there and didn't have medical training, and if the ambulance hadn't arrived soon, Vesna probably wouldn't have survived. Experts believe that Vesna survived because she was trapped behind the food cart in the plane's tail, which kept her from falling or being sucked out when the aircraft was falling to the ground and splitting into 3 pieces. Another lucky coincidence was that the rear end in which she was pinned landed in the wooded part covered with snow, and that cushioned the impact of aircraft with the ground. Physicians determined that her low blood pressure caused her to quickly pass out when the cabin depressurized, which prevented her heart from bursting upon impact. Even Vesna said in later interview that she knew that her low pressure could keep her from passing flight attendant exam, so before she drank an excessive amount of coffee to keep the blood pressure high and pass the exam. After the crash, Vesna Vulović has become somewhat of a national hero, and she became globally known. She was honored by Yugoslav President Josip Broz Tito, and famous Yugoslavian folk singer Miroslav Ilić even wrote a song about her, named simply Vesna the Flight Attendant. She was soon made the honorary citizen of town České Kamenice, where the accident happened. Numerous local and foreign media wanted to do interviews with her. However, her employer, Yacht Airlines, wasn't that enthusiastic about the whole situation, as Vesna did not remember the accident. After her recovery, she wanted to continue with her normal life and return to her job being flight attendant. Although Vesna has become a celebrity, the airlines felt that her presence on flights would attract too much bad publicity and that it would create negative ambience on the flight. So instead, they gave her a desk job in the company. However, she did continue flying for personal purposes. She was working in a company until early 1990s, when she was fired from her job after taking part in anti-government protests during the breakup of Yugoslavia. She could even face being arrested. However, the government was afraid of negative publicity that her imprisonment would bring. In her private life, in 1977, she married her friend's brother, Nicola Breca, a mechanical engineer, and lived with him in a small 36-meter square apartment in Belgrade. Unfortunately, their love didn't last forever, and they divorced in early 1990s, which was not the luckiest time for Vesna, as she lost her job as well around that time. Although the doctors believed she wouldn't be able to have children due to immense trauma her body has lived through, she did get pregnant. But there were major complications because the pregnancy was ectopic. An ectopic pregnancy is when a fertilized egg implants itself outside of the womb, usually in one of the fallopian tubes. She almost died and was never able to get pregnant again. After getting fired and divorcing, Vesna continued her work as a pro-democracy activist. She also declined therapy to help her coping with the trauma and turned to religion instead, becoming a devout Orthodox Christian. In the last of her years, she lived alone in her small apartment with pension of a little over $300 monthly. She was mostly secluded and struggled with survival guilt. She never stopped wondering whether her parents would have lived longer if her accident hadn't happened. She never completely understood and accepted people saying that she was so lucky, as her life after the accident was everything but easy. She did agree to do a few interviews during the years, but never felt quite comfortable in the center of attention, and she would rather avoid it most of the time. She even declined the invitations from Oprah and BBC. She was just tired of discussing and explaining her fall, especially because she never regained memory of the accident and the days following. She regularly attended the yearly crash commemorations in Srpska Kamenica until her deteriorating health prevented her from participating. She died alone in her apartment in December 2016 at 66 years old. Her body was found only after a few days later when locksmiths had broken into the apartment. They were called by her concerned friends who thought it was strange that she wasn't picking up her phone for days. She was buried on Belgrade's new cemetery on 23rd of December 2016. What or who caused the explosion stays unknown until this day. Vesna later remembered that she and her colleagues had seen a man in Copenhagen airport who was standing out from the crowd, as he was very anxious and strange. Apparently he was in the plane, but never boarded again when the plane was departing from Copenhagen. She was convinced that he put the bomb on the plane. There were various theories, such as the one that the plane got too close to the nuclear weapon storage, so it was brought down by the military. In 2009, two Prague-based journalists, Peter Hornung Andresen and Pavel Tajner, claimed that Flight 367 was mistaken for an enemy aircraft and shot down by the Czechoslovak Air Force at the altitude of only 2,600 feet. That would also mean that the Guinness World Record wasn't real. However, these claims were dismissed as a conspiracy theory with only circumstantial evidence. One of the most important evidence were the plane's black boxes retrieved from the crash site, which had all data on them. They even recorded the last words from the passengers and the crew, which proves that they were alive after the explosion, but lost their lives due to different reasons somewhere in between 33,000 feet and the ground. One of the crew members can be heard saying, "Mom, I'm coming, Mom." Destiny is an interesting thing, and played hard with Vesna in this occasion. Vesna Vulovic was actually never supposed to be in this plane, and wasn't even scheduled as a crew member for this flight. The airlines confused her with her colleague, whose name was also Vesna, and they called Vesna Vulovic to duty by mistake. Vesna later said that she was excited when they called and hadn't asked any additional questions, as it was her first time flying this route. She recalled that the crew members were behaving a little different on the day, like they had unconsciously known that they will die. She said they cancelled sightseeing they had planned and went to buy things for their families instead. The flight captain was locked in his room all previous day, which was unusual. The co-pilot was talking about his son and daughter like as if nobody else had a son or a daughter. Immediately after the crash, a passport was found near the place where Vesna was lying injured. However, it was a passport from other woman in the rear part, who succumbed to her injuries. This made a short confusion during which her mother has heard on the news that her daughter died, and it was thought that the other woman survived. The parts of Vesna's uniform, which had to be cut upon her arrival to the hospital, were later given to her mother, who kept them at their home. 6 weeks after the crash, villager Bruno Henke, who saved Vesna's life, became a grandfather of a beautiful blonde baby girl. At that time, she wasn't aware of it, but later in life she would find out that she got her name Vesna after amazing survivor Vesna Vulovic.